Hey guys, Ted here to give you another lecture. Today's lecture, we are going to discuss part two of our lecture on the progressive era. Namely picking up from where we left off. In our last lecture, we left off on a kind of depressive note. We last left off talking about Theodore Roosevelt and his double whammy, losing his wife Alice and his mother all in the same day. It sent him into what can essentially be defined as a nervous breakdown. Roosevelt retreated from government. He left and he went to his Dakota ranch, the Badlands. And at the Badlands, while at his ranch, he wrote two books. One about hunting. Two books actually. Both of them were about hunting. And Roosevelt actually became a noted expert on the plant life and animal life of the Great Plains. He also became a noted admirer of the first settlers of the plains, and he began to deeply and genuinely hate the plains native populations. He began to view them as impediments to the progress of American settlement and of the ranching community of the Dakotas. He began to revel in their displacement, and this reveals a lot about Roosevelt, his views on natives and on the contemporary issues of the 1880s, particularly with the Western settlement of the Great Plains, and also a lot about the prevailing thoughts and ideas on natives during this time. Some kind of eye-catching revelations about Roosevelt and the era coming from these writings and coming from his writings about being on the plains. Roosevelt had noted earlier, he really lamented missing out on the Civil War, which was this great sort of martial, broad experience that men of that age sort of all look back to. Roosevelt began to, during the 1880s, intensify his belief in what we call purification through violence. He was also an advocate of imperialism. In the 1880s, European imperialism was reaching fever pitch. The scramble for Africa was taking place. China was being aggressively pursued by the European great and small powers, had they all began to vie and jockey with each other for colonial fiefdoms. And Theodore Roosevelt was an early and a consistent advocate of the United States joining the hunt for additional territories. In the 1890s, he strongly began to push for the creation of an American colonial empire, citing the fact that the United States military, industrial capacity, and economic situation largely afforded the United States the right to do so. He looked to men like Rudyard Kipling, who wrote the now discredited poem "The White Man's Burden," as not only justification but also moral inspiration for serving his nation in such a capacity. Roosevelt defended his beliefs by stating that only weak men, feeble men, effeminate men would not want to seize colonies. William Jennings Bryan, who was an early leader of the anti-colonial colonialization movement, countered Roosevelt by pointedly reminding imperialists and Roosevelt that the United States was once a European colony, that the United States had fought an anti-colonial war to escape colonial oppression from a European power. He capped off such points by stating that the United States had no business subjecting other nations to colonialism. Now, these arguments were not well received by Roosevelt and other colonialization or imperialists. They rejected these arguments, and they pointedly called William Jennings Bryan and other anti-imperialists weak men, effeminate men, and reading between the lines, they called them cowards. This was a pointed attack at them to sort of sort of cow them into joining them to reaffirm their masculinity. Now, in 1898, the United States went to war with Spain. And at this point, Spain was the sick man of Europe. And the sick man of Europe is a term, is a phrase or a reference used to describe a European power that was once one of the great powers of Europe, but had fallen on hard times and was now a shell of itself. And that was Spain. Spain had been the great hegemonic power of Europe under the Habsburgs. Going all the way back to our early lectures on colonization and first contact, Spain had very quickly displaced the native powers, the native regional powers in the Americas, in South America and Central America, and throughout the Southwest, from California to Texas, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. She had displaced all those powers, all those indigenous regional powers, and become the hegemonic state in the New World. And she reigned over this empire largely from, let's see, Mexico was formally incorporated, had a Spanish possession of 1520, and around 1519, 1521, all the way down to 1821, 1820, 1821. So roughly 300 years, Spain reaped the benefits of this world empire. Spain also held possessions in the Pacific, the Philippines, and Guam. She still held possessions in North America, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. She had lost those Latin American states during the Latin American revolutions, spearheaded by Jose San Martin, and of course Simon Bolivar. And she had lost the Dominican Republic to the Haitians. The Haitians invaded and freed the slaves in the Dominican Republic, and that ended Spanish rule over the Dominicans in the Dominican Republic. But Spain still held Cuba and Puerto Rico in North America, and the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific. And at this very moment, the Cubans were engaged in a war of independence. They were fighting the Spanish for their independence. And this was a war they were losing. The Cubans were losing this war. But an event happened that would change the course of history and the destinies of all those places that Spain still held possession to. That would be the explosion of a United States ship. Now, at the time, the United States blamed Spain, saying that the Spanish intentionally fired upon their ship, killing those sailors. It was later discovered that the Spanish didn't fire on the ship, that the reason that the ship exploded was that the boiler exploded. And when the boiler exploded, the ship went up. But nobody cared about it at the time. Even if you have presented these facts, even if sailors themselves had said no Spanish official fired on us, tempers were already flared, and the imperialists were ready to pounce and seize this moment. Very quickly, war was declared on Spain, and very quickly, sailors and soldiers were sent out to take the Spanish possessions, not just to not just help the Cubans win their war, but to take Puerto Rico from Spain, to take the Philippines from Spain. At this time, Theodore Roosevelt was actually serving in the presidential cabinet of William McKinley. He was serving as the Undersecretary of the Navy, a very high senior cabinet position. Now, Roosevelt resigned his government post and joined the war effort in Cuba. He was commissioned as a colonel and raised a volunteer regiment all on his own. And he called this regiment the Rough Riders. And the Rough Riders were a cavalry unit. Now, in the 1890s, as we have covered, there was a lot of social upheaval, and Roosevelt, like many of his contemporaries, the imperialists and the anti-imperialists, had hoped that this war would be seen and viewed as an opportunity for the Republic to heal itself of the social injuries and to really come together for the great patriotic cause. Roosevelt very consciously tried to incorporate every social group into his regiment. He particularly drew on men from his New York high society friends, and also men from his Dakota ranching days, as a symbolic union of the Republic. All segments of the Republic coming together to fight for the nation, to do their national duty. Now, Roosevelt, during the Spanish War, Roosevelt did win some renown for himself. He a great deal was made of him leading a charge up Kettle Hill during the Spanish War. And Roosevelt even wrote a book about the war and his unit, aptly named the Rough Riders. Now, Roosevelt was long accustomed to using journalists to gain as much exposure as possible. He was also able to dominate the dispatches coming back from Cuba. He made sure that every dispatch coming from Cuba had a mention of the Rough Riders, something that they did, whether they were just being bad boys stealing from Army headquarters, or whether they were purportedly fighting and engaging with the Spaniards, or just doing some sort of aid for the Cubans. Roosevelt ensured that his men, his unit, his name was on every dispatch. He had that type of clout with the journalists. He had a very easygoing nature with them, a very beneficial relationship with them. Roosevelt used his personal charm and his personal rhetoric to instill a certain swagger among his subordinates. They became known for breaking the rules. They became the bad boys of the army, so to speak. They were known for, as I stated, stealing supplies from headquarters. And Roosevelt himself had a very low opinion of his commanding officer, General Shafter. He often referred to him, and this is, you can still see it in his writings. He referred to Shafter as that fat old slob. Now, the soldiers of the regular army bitterly came to resent Roosevelt and his unit. Particularly, they took great offense at how Roosevelt manipulated how the story was told to audiences back home. Because of Roosevelt's manipulation of the press, everybody back home believed that Roosevelt and the Rough Riders were single-handedly winning the war in Cuba. That every major engagement the Roosevelt's Rough Riders were involved in, and that when they weren't involved, things weren't being done. All the clout, all the glory fell on Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Now, the United States military remembered this when the United States declared war on the Central Powers during World War I. Roosevelt, then an elderly man, begged to be allowed to revive the Rough Riders, but was denied and excluded from the war effort. In the post-war celebrations, Roosevelt was riding high. After the Spanish War ended, Roosevelt was that great figure. He was that great, renowned, great, revered figure in the United States. He was the man that everybody had heard of from the war. And he rode this popularity to the governorship of New York. He won the governorship in 1900. He won the governorship in 1899. Didn't resign. He didn't run for re-election. He got picked up as the running mate for William McKinley for the 1900 presidential election, and was sworn in as vice president in 1901. Now, following William McKinley's assassination in September of 1901, Roosevelt found himself in the presidency. This was a meteoric rise. Never before, and really never since, had there been such a high and dramatic rise for a politician. Going from an undersecretary to a volunteer colonel to governor to vice president and then the president of the United States in such a short time. It was less than 3 years. His massive political rise was less than 3 years. But it wasn't all roses. There were many leaders in the Republican Party who were weary of Roosevelt. Remember, Roosevelt's his personal politics, his personal policies wasn't really well known. He hadn't been in politics that long. He hadn't been a central figure in politics. He hadn't been someone who had built up enough political clout, enough political capital to really win off, to really have a reputation of his own. They simply used him because they simply paired him with McKinley because he was this great popular figure. He wasn't supposed to have any sort of role in McKinley's second administration. But with McKinley's death he became the man, and he became the youngest man to serve as president of the United States. And his age was another strike against him. Many pointed to the fact that he was so young. He was in his early 40s when he became president. Many looked at him and said he's too young to do this. He doesn't have enough experience to be president. This is going to be disastrous for us, having such a young man in office. Roosevelt went on to largely reinvigorate the office of president. As I stated earlier, none of the presidents after Abraham Lincoln had really earned much renown on their own. None of their presidencies have really been memorable in any fashion. Now, to be certain, these men were accomplished in their own way, and they do deserve recognition. James Garfield, for one, deserves a lot of recognition. Chester Arthur deserves recognition. They were good men. James Garfield, unfortunately, was assassinated, but Garfield himself was a good public speaker. Garfield himself had a very strong record on civil rights. Had Garfield lived out his presidency, there's no doubt that he would have made a very positive impact on the Republic, especially coming off of the corruption of Grant's administration and the cloud that hung over the head of Hayes's administration. Unfortunately, Garfield was murdered. So we can only point back to it and say of what could have been. Cleveland had 2 terms in office, but Cleveland never really hit a stride himself. He won 2 elections, but his second term was marred. It was mired in problems stemming from the economic panic, the depression of 1893, which dominated and dogged his presidency. But Roosevelt reinvigorated the office of president. Roosevelt was that guy that people sort of looked to. He very quickly on became a very popular figure for the nation. One of the ways that Roosevelt distinguished himself from the pack was that he deviated almost immediately from his predecessors and sort of pushing. Roosevelt pushed for legislation on his own. He believed it was appropriate for the president to take the initiative and help him formulate legislation. And this coupled with the fact that he was a masterly, artful speaker, and that he was able to handle the press so expertly, really enhanced his appeal and his draw and his ability to get things done. Now, Roosevelt was able to appeal to the everyday citizen. He was able to put forth ideas relating to citizenship and the direction of the republic that really struck a chord with the average citizen. Roosevelt was also able to, he was really the first president to take environmentalism seriously, and he prevented the indiscriminate use of natural resources. One thing that preoccupied Roosevelt thought as president was the closing of the American frontier. Remember, he was deeply attached to the idea of the American frontier. He deeply believed that the United States were becoming more effeminate, that men of his era were losing that swagger, that sort of the sort of frontier impetus to be more manly, to be more commanding. So that was something that really dominated his presidency and his mind and his thinking. And really, it sort of hung over the head of really all Americans. The frontier, from the earliest colonial days, there was always a frontier. The frontier had played an amazing and central role in the mystique surrounding the Republic, and in 1890 it was gone. There were no more frontiers in what we call the lower 48, the 48 continuous state from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. There was no more frontier. All the territories had been carved up, had been assigned. 4 states alone came in 1890. in 1896, in 1890, there were only four territories left in the lower 48. Utah, which would come in as a state in 1896, when polygamy was finally abandoned. Oklahoma, which would be joined with the Indian Territory in 1907, and of course New Mexico and Arizona, which came in jointly, not joined together, but came in on the same date in 1912. Sorry, Valentine's Day, 1912. So by 1890, the frontier had largely disappeared. There was no more American frontier. Now, Roosevelt had favored the acquisition of Spanish territories and actively pursued an engaging foreign policy. He sent the United States Navy, then termed the Great White Fleet, around the world, and he used this to signal to the other powers that the United States had now matured into a full member of the great powers of the world. Nobody at the time thought of it like that. The United States Navy, it made an impressive show, but the United States Navy was nowhere near as large as the British or Imperial Germany's navies. It was nonetheless represented to be a force to be reckoned with, but if push had come to shove, the German Navy one-on-one would have easily defeated the Great White Fleet. It was not as impressive. And of course, a British strategy had always been to have a navy twice as large, had the two largest fleets, and to always remain on friendly terms with one of those two largest rival fleets, to ensure that they could not be joined together against the British fleet. Now, the United States, under Roosevelt, really sort of began to break out of its mold. The United States has largely stayed out of European wars. Not really European affairs, but European wars. In 1906, Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in ending the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. This was a war that erupted between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire that ended in the complete destruction of Russia's fleet at the hands of the Japanese. It was Ottawa on water. It was a European great power being defeated by a non-European inferior, and being defeated badly. Ottawa has shattered the myth of European invincibility in Africa, in East Africa, and the Russo-Japanese War had largely shattered the invincibility of European fleets, European navies, to peoples around the world. Though those two events, Ottawa and the Russo-Japanese, the Italo-Ethiopian War of 1896 and the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 were two great events that sort of heralded the end of colonialism. They were harbingers of things to come. But Roosevelt won the Peace Prize in 1906 for his efforts there, and Roosevelt oversaw the Panamanian Revolution and the construction of the Panama Canal. Now, the United States wanted to build that canal in either Panama or Nicaragua. Sorry if I messed it up. I have a feeling that I did. But they wanted to build it there to capitalize on interoceanic voyaging. And at the time, they were trying to cut a deal with Colombia, because Panama at the time was a province of Colombia. But the Colombian government couldn't really come to any sort of concrete deal with the United States. So the United States fomented a rebellion by Panamanians, telling them that they would aid them in the war and that they would cut favorable trade deals with them if they rebelled. The Panamanians rebelled, aided by the Americans, won their independence, and awarded the Americans the contract to build the Panama Canal. Now, with the Panama Canal, after its completion, communication and travel time were cut significantly for the United States military and commercial purposes, as ships were now able to cross from the Pacific to the Atlantic with ease. You didn't have to sail around South America anymore. It became much more easier for them to simply communicate, for them to simply go about their business. Now, the major dilemma during Roosevelt's tenure in office was trust, was the trust question. Now, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 had largely been defined by the Supreme Court, and only 18 cases had really been heard under the tenure of its three immediate predecessors, Cleveland, McKinley, and Harrison. Um, the fear of monopolies stemmed from the lack of or the ruthless elimination of competition by monopolists. Competition ensured that prices were reasonable and that the goods that the consumers were receiving were of a high quality. Um, if there were no competition in business, then the monopolist could simply inflate the prices at will and offer merchandises that were very low in quality. Roosevelt made a distinction between what he considered good trust and bad trust. And he had the view that competition eventually led to one winner, which really isn't a bad thing. And if the business that was to emerge had the monopoly continued to behave as though it was still in competition with rivals, then it is only then it is also a good thing. He viewed that he viewed a monopoly as only being bad when the business abuses its monopoly, when it doesn't provide a quality product to consumers, and when it overcharges, inflates the price of their good to consumers. Okay, so that's where Roosevelt is coming with his ideas on trust. Now, if opposition to trust or monopolies was thus limited to patterns of misconduct and not the accumulation of wealth, Roosevelt said, then we could really sort of bust those trusts. We can really sort of make business better. We can sort of make it more equitable. We can sort of ensure that the average citizen would have a square deal. And this is where Roosevelt really sort of where he again made a name for himself and set a pattern for American politics. Deals. Politicians after Roosevelt would always come up with their deal. Franklin Roosevelt had the New Deal, based off of Roosevelt's Square Deal. Johnson had that. Lyndon Johnson had that Great Society, and other presidents. They would always come up with this deal to sort of harken back to Roosevelt's Square Deal. Now, Roosevelt did go after trust. He did. And there are a lot of famous sayings, a lot of comedic sayings for Roosevelt's actions going after trust. And he did go after what he deemed as bad trust. One would be the North Security Corporation, which had monopolized the railroads of the Pacific Northwest and raised the rates to an unbearable levels. Now the government ordered the monopoly to break up and restored competition in railroads in the Pacific Northwest. That was one way in which Roosevelt handled the trust. Another way he did was to not prosecute monopolies like U.S. Steel, because he did not see U.S. Steel monopoly as threatening the industry. He did pursue a policy of regulating corporations whose conduct had public consequences. Remembering his horror over how sausages were made, he introduced legislation that eventually led to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. He also had a hand in the development of the Hepburn Act of 1906, which strengthened congressional oversight of interstate commerce and thus impacted the oversight of the railroad industry. And we'll break here and we'll come up with part 3 of our look at Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressive Era. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about the information in this lecture. As always, I am Ted, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.